212th Contact. Thursday, November 6, 1986, 1:04 a.m. Quetzal says, I concerned myself in detail around the clarification of your question regarding the authenticity of the biblical books. In this regard, I also asked our historians and worked through all the historical records that were placed at my disposal. It became entirely perceptible that all the biblical books were not written in a single case by those persons to whom they are ascribed. So it is also incorrect that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles come from Luke, and furthermore, the book of Job was not written by this man himself. Both books of the Bible are based on what was written down at a later time, as well as various books of the New Testament. Moreover, the letters that are listed in the New Testament also weren't written by those to whom they are assigned. In truth, these were illiterates, who let their scribes write the letters, to whom they had to pay remunerations. Thus, one who was dictating a letter also couldn't control what the scribe wrote down, whereby it escaped the one dictating that very many things were falsified. This also applies to the fantastic stories that surround Paul, who, in his consciousness confusion, saw himself as a martyr and, thus, also lived and worked accordingly, and following this, he then ultimately died by assassins, as this also happened with Moses, who made many enemies within his own ranks, who then robbed him of his life. Billy says, so it actually isn't like what I said on June 11th, when I thought that Luke was the writer of the Gospel of Luke and of the Acts of the Apostles. Yes, Sfath already said that Luke could neither write nor read, as this should have also been true of the others who are praised as Bible and New Testament writers. But what about the Gospel of Matthew? Were you also able to clarify this? Quetzal says, I was also able to do that, yes. Matthew was just as ignorant of reading and writing as all the others, to whom the Gospels and the books of the Bible are attributed. The Gospel of Matthew was dictated by Matthew to a scribe named Joshua, who interpreted the whole thing in his free discretion and wrote it down and, consequently, also falsified it. Billy says, does one know the reason, then, why all the books and letters are, nevertheless, attributed to the disciples and evangelists and prophets? Quetzal says, it should be noted that out of Emmanuel's disciples, only Judas Iscariot was actually acquainted with reading and writing, for he was which no one knew and, therefore, which also wasn't handed down the scribe, who left his profession, however, and became a follower of Emmanuel. As a result of many years of investigations, which were also carried out by our scientists and historians through time travels, it is to be explained that already during the outset of the origin of Christianity, the disciples and evangelists were anxious to give the impression that they were experts of reading and writing and, thus, more highly educated than the common people. This was because the simple persons among the people were of the erroneous view that those who were more highly educated than others would just know and understand more and, consequently, would also be enabled and authorized to teach the more unknowing and uneducated people. An erroneous evil that has survived on the earth to the current day among all nations of the earth, which is also why the people of today's time are still of this misconception. Through this, like at that time, the people are title-believing and office-believing, and they let themselves be suppressed, exploited, or just held down by those who have a rank and a reputation and who occupy an office. So even today, it is in such a way as in the time of Emmanuel and of the old prophets. And precisely of these, it remains to be said that not one of them has written down his offered teachings or his history. Indeed, this was done by others, even the scribes, who are instructed to do so. The first Torah originated from this, but it was later destroyed up to the last letter by a major fire, and consequently, there were no more written records, and everything was just handed down by word of mouth over generations. Needless to say, The consequence of this was that enormously many falsifications arose, until one day, 12 self-proclaimed prophets, out of their own grace, gathered a large number of scribes around themselves and went out with these into an outlying area, where they lived for 40 days in austere form and, during this time, wrote down 240 books, from which then, over time, the New Torah emerged, from which then also the Bible of Christianity emerged, to which the New Testament was then simply added. Billy says, but in addition, it must be said, so that no misunderstandings arise, that on the one hand, every one of the so-called prophets told his scribe those things and stories in the way he had received them from the various sources. Also, it must be made clear that the so-called books cannot be compared to today's books, which often contain several hundred pages. Most of the books of the self-proclaimed prophets, their writing experts, and, thus, their scribes, only contain a few pages apart from the books of Moses and some others. But of these books, the majority vanished again. Consequently, today, to my knowledge, only 33 of these are available in the Bible. As I have learned, in the Old Testament scriptures, one will first notice Moses, Joshua and Judges, Ruth and 2 of Samuel, 2 of Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, with Esther, these as history books. Then, as poetic books, there are Job, Psalms, then the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. These are followed by the prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, then Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, followed by Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, along with Haggai, Zechariah and finally Malachi. Quetzal says, and you can still enumerate all this from your memory. Billy says, what's learned is learned. But slowly, my memory becomes overstocked with debris. But for the time being, it still works. So I still know the books of the New Testament. These go in such a way, so the history books, in the New, there stands Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, together with the Acts of the Apostles. The letters are listed as follows, then the Romans, 2 Corinthians, Galatians and Ephesians, Philippians and Colossians, both Thessalonians, Timothy and Titus, Philemon, 2 of Peter, 3 of John, Hebrews, James, and the letter of Jude. Then comes the prophetic book, finally, Revelation closes the whole Bible. Person, use what you read to the blessing, not to the curse. Quetzal says, truly remarkable. Billy says, what I particularly like about it is the conclusion. If only people would maintain their thoughts and feelings in this manner and then act accordingly. But for the majority of humanity, this seems to be a hurdle that will still need thousands of years to be mastered. Quetzal says, unfortunately, a true word. And when I think of the coming terrible events of the future, then your words contain a very sad truth. The people of the earth will still cry out in the coming years, when the to-be, note, Bush, as father and son, take over the presidency in America, as I've told you. Both of them will be inhuman warmongers and will cause contempt for human life and evil acts of war to be spread into the wide world, in their self-glorification and vindictiveness and in their lust for power, thereby stirring up terrorism throughout the world, but they will also exert themselves under the guise of peacemaking. In truth, they will indulge themselves in a form of terrorism, like Earth humanity has never seen or experienced before. Their terrorism will encounter foreign countries in a warlike manner and will demand many thousands of human lives.